September 1944 marked a turning point in the Italian campaign that few historians would adequately document in the immediate aftermath of World War II. As Allied forces pushed northward through the battered Italian peninsula, the residents of villages scattered across Tuscany witnessed something that shattered every preconception carefully constructed by fascist propaganda over the previous 2 decades. Black American soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, disembarked from transport vehicles onto Italian soil, and the locals stared with a mixture of astonishment, curiosity, and dawning realization that everything Mussolini's regime had told them about race was a calculated lie. The division arrived in late summer, when the Tuscan countryside still blazed with golden sunlight across rolling hills, dotted with cypress trees and ancient stone farmhouses. For many Italian civilians, particularly those in rural areas, this represented their first encounter with black people in the flesh. Fascist propaganda had spent years depicting people of African descent as primitive, dangerous, and subhuman. Schoolchildren had been taught through racist textbooks and films that portrayed black individuals as creatures barely above animals. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 had been justified through this racist ideology, painting Italians as superior civilizers, bringing order to supposedly barbaric lands. Yet here stood these American soldiers, disciplined and well-equipped, treating Italian civilians with a respect and dignity that starkly contrasted with the retreating German forces who had occupied their towns. The cognitive dissonance proved overwhelming for many Italians. These were not the monsters from propaganda posters. These were young men who smiled at children, shared their rations with hungry families, and conducted themselves with military professionalism that commanded respect. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, the 92nd Infantry Division comprised approximately 15,000 soldiers, making it one of only 2 black combat divisions to see action in the European theater during World War II. The division included the 365th, 366th, 371st, and 370th Infantry Regiments, along with supporting artillery and engineering units. The soldiers themselves arrived in Italy carrying their own burden of experiences with American racism. Many had trained at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where they faced segregation and discrimination even as they prepared to fight for their country. They had endured the humiliation of Jim Crow laws, seen whites-only signs throughout the American South, and understood intimately the gap between American ideals and American reality. Yet they came to Italy as liberators, ready to fight fascism abroad while knowing that racism awaited them back home. The initial encounters between black soldiers and Italian civilians occurred in small towns south of Florence, in places like Lucca, Viareggio, and the mountain villages of the Serchio Valley. Italian families cautiously approached these unexpected liberators. The soldiers, for their part, found themselves in a strange position. Many spoke no Italian, yet they communicated through gestures, shared cigarettes, and chocolate bars that became universal languages of goodwill. October 1944 brought an unexpected warmth to the relationship between the Buffalo Soldiers and Italian civilians that transcended language barriers and preconceived notions. In the town of Bagnone, nestled in the Apuan Alps, a remarkable transformation began unfolding in the collective consciousness of the local population. Maria Coretti, a schoolteacher who had dutifully taught fascist racial theories to her students for nearly a decade, found herself questioning everything she had accepted as truth when she witnessed Sergeant James Thompson from Detroit organizing a medical clinic for Italian children suffering from malnutrition and disease. The propaganda machine had prepared Italians for many things, but not for this reality. Mussolini's regime had invested heavily in creating a racial hierarchy that positioned Italians as superior Mediterranean peoples, distinct from and above both Northern Europeans and especially people of African descent. The invasion of Ethiopia had been portrayed as a civilizing mission, with newsreels and newspapers depicting Italian soldiers bringing modernity and order to what they termed primitive peoples. Children in schools had measured skulls and studied charts purporting to show scientific evidence of racial differences and the superiority of the Italian race. The Buffalo Soldiers dismantled these lies simply by being themselves. In the village of Somocolonia, Private Robert Madison from Mississippi helped rebuild a church damaged by German artillery, working alongside local stonemasons, who initially kept their distance but gradually warmed to his genuine kindness and skilled hands. In Camaiore, Corporal William Hayes from Chicago organized impromptu jazz performances that drew curious crowds, the music creating bridges that words could not. Italian women in particular found themselves at the center of a social earthquake. The fascist regime had promoted strict codes of racial purity, warning Italian women against any contact with non-Europeans. Yet here in the chaos of war's aftermath, with Italian men dead, captured, or scattered, these Black American soldiers represented safety, resources, and often genuine kindness in a world turned upside down. Relationships began forming that would scandalize both the remaining fascist sympathizers and, ironically, many white American officers who brought their own racial prejudices from across the Atlantic. The soldiers faced a complex situation. While many Italian civilians welcomed them warmly, some white American officers maintained the same segregationist attitudes that pervaded the United States military. The Army remained officially segregated, with black soldiers serving in all-black units under predominantly white officers. This created bizarre situations where black soldiers fought for freedom abroad while denied basic dignity by their own command structure. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ray, one of the few black officers in a leadership position, documented in his diary the surreal nature of Italian responses to his men. Italian partisans, the resistance fighters who had opposed German occupation, proved especially welcoming. They recognized competent soldiers when they saw them and cared little for the color of their skin. Many partisans had risked everything fighting fascism and understood instinctively that racial ideology represented one of fascism's most poisonous elements. The German forces, still occupying northern Italy, attempted to exploit racial divisions through their own propaganda, dropping leaflets that warned Italian civilians about the American forces while emphasizing the presence of black soldiers. These efforts largely failed. Italians had experienced German occupation firsthand, had witnessed the brutality of Nazi racial policies, and increasingly recognized propaganda when they saw it. November 1944 thrust the 92nd Infantry Division into the brutal mountain warfare that would define the Italian campaign's final stages. The Gothic Line, a formidable German defensive position stretching across the northern Apennines, represented one of the war's most challenging battlegrounds. Here, amidst peaks shrouded in early winter fog and valleys turned to mud by autumn rains, Black American soldiers proved their combat effectiveness, while Italian civilians watched from their damaged homes and hidden mountain refuges. The terrain itself seemed designed to break armies. Steep mountainsides covered in chestnut forests gave way to rocky outcroppings that provided German machine gunners with commanding fields of fire. Ancient stone farmhouses, built centuries ago to withstand harsh alpine winters, became fortified positions that required close combat to capture. The soldiers of the 92nd found themselves fighting uphill, literally and figuratively, against both a determined enemy and the skepticism of some within their own command structure. Captain Charles Thomas from Detroit led his company in an assault on German positions near the village of Cinquale that November. Despite being wounded by enemy fire, Thomas refused evacuation and continued directing his men for another 6 hours until the objective was secured. His actions would eventually earn him a Medal of Honor, though the recognition would come decades late in 1997, reflecting the systemic racism that denied black soldiers their due recognition during the war itself. Italian civilians hiding in cellars and caves heard the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifle fire as these battles raged across their homeland. They saw black soldiers carrying wounded comrades down mountainsides, establishing aid stations, and displaying the same courage and sacrifice as any soldiers in history. The contrast with fascist propaganda became impossible to ignore. These were not primitives or inferiors. These were professional soldiers fighting and dying to liberate Italy from fascism and Nazi occupation. The partisan fighters, increasingly active as German power waned, coordinated closely with the Buffalo Soldiers. In the mountains around Massa and Carrara, famous for their marble quarries, partisan leader Gino Lombardi worked directly with units of the 371st Infantry Regiment. Lombardi later recalled in his memoirs that the black American soldiers showed none of the arrogance that some white Allied troops displayed. They treated partisans as equals, valued their local knowledge, and fought alongside them with mutual respect. Winter descended on the Apennines with brutal efficiency. December brought snow that turned the mountains into a frozen hell. Supply lines struggled to function on icy mountain roads. Soldiers on both sides endured temperatures that dropped well below freezing at night. The Buffalo Soldiers, many from southern American states where they had never experienced such cold, adapted and persevered. Italian families, themselves struggling with scarce food and fuel, often shared what little they had with these soldiers who were bleeding to liberate their country. The fighting around the Serchio Valley in late December saw some of the division's most intense combat. German forces launched a counteroffensive that threatened to break through Allied lines. The soldiers of the 92nd held their positions despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Private First Name Ernest Jenkins from Louisiana later described the desperate fighting in an interview preserved at the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress, recalling how Italian civilians brought them hot food and intelligence about German movements even as artillery shells fell around them. January 1945 witnessed the deepening of bonds between the Buffalo Soldiers and Italian communities that would reshape social attitudes for generations. In the coastal town of Viareggio, where damaged hotels and villas bore scars from German occupation and Allied bombardment, an extraordinary social experiment unfolded almost by accident. The military government required billeting arrangements for troops, which meant black American soldiers lived in close proximity to Italian families, ate meals prepared by Italian mothers and grandmothers, and became integrated into daily life in ways that challenged every remaining prejudice. Giuseppe Tonelli, a shopkeeper in Viareggio who had served in Mussolini's army in Ethiopia, experienced a profound personal transformation. He had participated in the colonial invasion, had accepted the racial propaganda that justified Italian imperialism, and had returned to Italy believing in Italian racial superiority. When soldiers from the 366th Infantry Regiment were billeted in buildings near his shop, Tonelli initially kept his distance, the old propaganda still echoing in his mind. But daily interactions gradually eroded these beliefs. He watched Sergeant William Crawford from Alabama help an elderly Italian woman carry water from a well. He saw soldiers sharing their tobacco rations with Italian men who had nothing. He heard them speak respectfully to Italian women, behaving as gentlemen when many expected otherwise. The children provided the clearest barometer of changing attitudes. Italian children, curious and adaptable as children everywhere, quickly overcame any taught prejudices. In the town square of Pietrasanta, kids followed soldiers around begging for candy and practicing broken English phrases. The soldiers, many far from their own children and siblings, responded with warmth and generosity. Private Marcus Wright from Georgia carried photographs of his own children and showed them to Italian youngsters, the universal language of family transcending all barriers. These interactions occurred against a backdrop of continuing military operations. The war had not ended, German forces still controlled much of northern Italy, and soldiers of the 92nd continued facing combat rotation. Yet even soldiers on short breaks from the front lines found themselves welcomed into Italian homes. Women prepared meals with carefully hoarded ingredients. Men shared homemade wine and grappa. The soldiers reciprocated with military rations, cigarettes, and soap, precious commodities in a war-ravaged economy. Romantic relationships, inevitable in such circumstances, developed between black soldiers and Italian women. These relationships scandalized multiple groups simultaneously. Remaining fascist sympathizers condemned them as racial defilement. White American officers, many carrying Southern racial attitudes, viewed them with suspicion and sometimes active hostility. The Army had official policies discouraging fraternization, though these proved impossible to enforce. Yet the relationships continued and multiplied, built on genuine human connection in extraordinary circumstances. Rosa Benedetti, a young woman from Lucca, fell in love with Corporal James Wilson from Philadelphia. Her family initially resisted, not from racial prejudice but from practical concerns. What future could such a relationship have? Wilson would eventually return to America. Could Rosa go with him? Would she face racism in the United States? Yet her parents also recognized that Wilson treated their daughter with respect and tenderness, that he was a good man in circumstances that revealed character. They gave their blessing, joining many Italian families making similar decisions. The Catholic Church found itself navigating complex waters. Parish priests had spent years supporting or at least not opposing fascist racial policies. Now they witnessed these relationships and the broader social transformation. Some priests remained rigid, preaching against mixed relationships. Others, recognizing the humanity and often the genuine love involved, quietly blessed couples and acknowledged that these Black American soldiers displayed Christian virtues regardless of skin color. February 1945 exposed the bitter irony that Black soldiers faced two different systems of racism simultaneously. While Italian civilians increasingly welcomed them, treating them as individuals and heroes, the American military hierarchy maintained rigid segregation that limited opportunities and recognition. White American soldiers received priority for promotions, awards, and even basic amenities. The Buffalo Soldiers liberated Italian towns only to find themselves directed to separate facilities, denied entry to clubs and recreation areas reserved for white troops. Lieutenant Harold Moore from Ohio documented this painful contradiction in letters to his wife that would later be donated to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Moore described Italian families inviting his men to dinner while white American officers objected to Black soldiers sitting in the same cafeterias. He wrote of Italian women treating his soldiers with dignity, while white American nurses sometimes refused to provide medical care. The absurdity reached peak levels when German prisoners of war, captured enemy soldiers, received better treatment in some American facilities than Black American soldiers who had risked their lives for victory. The town of Forte dei Marmi illustrated these tensions dramatically. The American command established a rest and recreation facility in this coastal resort area. White troops enjoyed beach access, organized entertainment, and comfortable accommodations. Black troops were directed to a separate, inferior facility with fewer amenities. Italian business owners, who had welcomed Black soldiers as liberators and customers, found themselves pressured by American military police to enforce segregation. Many Italians refused, leading to conflicts where Italian civilians sided with Black soldiers against white American military authorities. This situation created strange alliances. Italian partisans, battle-hardened resistance fighters who had spent years opposing fascism, recognized the parallels between Nazi racial ideology and American segregation. They had fought one form of racist oppression and felt instinctive sympathy for those suffering another. Partisan leader Carlo Bruni made his position clear in local meetings, stating that any establishment that served white Americans but refused Black Americans would be boycotted by partisans. His stance carried weight in communities where partisans were respected as heroes. The soldiers themselves struggled with these contradictions. They had volunteered or been drafted to fight for American freedom and democracy. They had risked their lives storming German positions, endured brutal mountain combat, and liberated Italian communities from occupation. Yet they remained second-class citizens in their own army, denied opportunities and recognition that white soldiers received automatically. Some became bitter. Others channeled their frustration into determination to prove their worth beyond any possible denial. Most simply endured, as they had endured racism in America, hoping that their military service would eventually force social change. March brought intensified combat operations as Allied forces prepared for the final push into northern Italy. The 92nd Infantry Division participated in operations along the Ligurian coast, fighting through German defensive positions with skill and determination. Yet even in combat, they faced skepticism from some quarters. When operations went well, white commanders sometimes credited supporting units. When problems arose, blame fell disproportionately on the Black soldiers. This pattern of prejudice, documented in after-action reports and later analyzed by military historians, reflected systemic racism that infected even battlefield assessments. Italian civilians noticed these patterns. They saw how black soldiers were treated by their own command structure and drew their own conclusions. For many Italians, this provided a profound education about racism beyond Italian borders. They had lived under fascist racial ideology and were now witnessing American racial segregation. The comparison prompted uncomfortable questions about discrimination and prejudice that extended far beyond Italy's borders. April 1945 brought the culmination of the Italian campaign as Allied forces launched their final offensive against crumbling German resistance. The Buffalo Soldiers participated in the drive toward the Po River Valley, fighting through the last defensive lines as German forces retreated in increasingly chaotic disorder. The city of Genoa fell on April 23rd, and the 92nd Infantry Division entered the city alongside partisan forces who had already begun the liberation from within. Italian civilians filled the streets in celebration, and black American soldiers found themselves embraced as liberators by crowds that saw heroes, not skin color. The fall of Mussolini and the final German collapse came in rapid succession. On April 28th, Italian partisans captured and executed Mussolini, ending the fascist dictator's inglorious attempt to maintain power in northern Italy under German protection. By early May, German forces in Italy had surrendered. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. For the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, the moment carried complex emotions. They had helped defeat fascism abroad, but Jim Crow segregation awaited them at home. The months following victory saw a gradual transition from combat operations to occupation duties and eventual demobilization. For Italian communities, particularly in Tuscany and the Ligurian coast where the Buffalo Soldiers had been concentrated, this transition period strengthened relationships that had formed during combat. Soldiers helped with reconstruction efforts, clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, and assisting with the massive humanitarian crisis created by years of war. These activities, performed without the immediate pressure of combat, allowed deeper connections to develop. Angela Marino, a nurse in Lucca, worked alongside medical personnel from the 92nd Division treating Italian civilians suffering from malnutrition, disease, and war injuries. She later wrote in her memoirs about the profound impact these interactions had on her worldview. She had been taught that race determined capability and character. Working daily with black doctors, medics, and support staff who displayed exceptional skill and compassion shattered these taught prejudices completely. She saw professionalism, expertise, and dedication that had nothing to do with skin color and everything to do with individual character and training. The children who had befriended soldiers during the war would carry memories throughout their lives. Franco Bartoli, 8 years old when the Buffalo Soldiers liberated his village near Massa, recalled decades later in an oral history interview how Sergeant Thomas Jackson from Alabama taught him to play baseball using improvised equipment in a damaged town square. For Franco, this black American soldier represented kindness, generosity, and heroism. The racial prejudices his fascist school teachers had tried to instill simply could not survive the reality of lived experience and genuine human connection. As soldiers gradually departed Italy through 1945 and into early 1946, thousands of relationships faced separation. Some soldiers and Italian women had married, creating families that would navigate complex challenges. These women faced the prospect of moving to America, often to southern states where racial segregation remained law. Others maintained relationships across oceans through letters, hoping to reunite someday. Many relationships simply ended with departure, wartime connections that could not survive peace and distance. The legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers in Italy extended far beyond military victory. They had helped destroy fascist racial ideology, not through propaganda but through personal example. Italian civilians who had been taught that black people were inferior primitives had witnessed courage, competence, and humanity that made such teachings obviously false. This social transformation, while incomplete and imperfect, represented a genuine shift in racial attitudes among populations that experienced direct contact with black American soldiers. August 1945 marked the beginning of large-scale redeployment as soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division prepared to return to the United States. The joy of survival and victory was tempered by the knowledge that they were returning to a country that still enforced legal segregation and denied them basic civil rights. Many soldiers had experienced treatment in Italy that contrasted sharply with their experiences in America. Italian civilians had welcomed them, respected them, and judged them by their character and actions rather than skin color. The return to American segregation loomed as a bitter homecoming. Private Robert Jackson from Alabama faced a particularly poignant departure. He had fallen deeply in love with Lucia Moretti, a young woman from Viareggio, whose family had welcomed him into their home. They had married in a small Catholic ceremony, and Lucia was pregnant with their first child. Jackson's joy at starting a family was overshadowed by fear of bringing his Italian wife to Alabama, where interracial marriage remained illegal, and where their family would face constant discrimination and potential violence. They discussed remaining in Italy, but Jackson had no means of supporting a family there with the war ended and his military service complete. They decided to brave Alabama together, hoping love would prove stronger than hatred. The troop ships carrying soldiers home reversed the journey that had brought them to war. On crowded transports crossing the Atlantic, men who had faced death together now contemplated uncertain futures. They had proven their courage and capability in combat, had earned commendations and medals, and had helped defeat fascism. Yet they knew that American society had not fundamentally changed during their absence. The same whites-only signs would greet them in bus stations and restaurants throughout the South. The same discrimination would limit their employment opportunities and housing choices. The same police would harass them for perceived violations of racial boundaries. For soldiers who had formed relationships with Italian women, the return proved especially complex. Military transport prioritized soldiers, with war brides following later through separate channels. This separation created anxiety and logistical nightmares. Some Italian women waited months in Italy for paperwork to be processed, living with their families while their soldier husbands tried to establish homes in America. The War Brides Act of 1945 facilitated immigration for foreign wives of American servicemen, but bureaucratic delays and complications plagued the process. Maria Gallo, who had married Corporal David Williams from Mississippi, arrived in New Orleans in November 1945. She spoke little English and had never experienced American racial segregation. Her introduction to her new country came when she and her husband were denied service at a restaurant near the port. Williams tried to explain the situation to her, but Maria's confusion and distress were profound. She had left Italy, where her Black American husband had been treated as a hero, to discover that in his own country, he was considered inferior. The shock of this realization stayed with her for life. The soldiers' reception in their home communities varied dramatically by region. In northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia, Black veterans received welcome home celebrations and parades. Communities proud of their soldiers' service organized events and recognized their sacrifices. Yet even in the North, veterans faced discrimination in employment and housing. Companies that had recruited Black workers during wartime labor shortages now reverted to preferring white employees. Housing developments used restrictive covenants to prevent Black families from purchasing homes in desirable neighborhoods. In the South, the situation was worse. Black veterans in uniform were still expected to observe Jim Crow segregation, to step off sidewalks for white pedestrians, to endure being called boy by white men regardless of their military rank or decorations. Some Black veterans, having experienced combat and having been treated with dignity in Italy, refused to accept this treatment passively. This resistance sometimes met violent response. Multiple documented incidents involved white civilians or police attacking Black veterans who did not show what whites considered proper deference. The year 1946 witnessed the beginning of what would become the modern civil rights movement, with Black veterans playing crucial leadership roles. Their experiences in Italy and elsewhere during World War II had fundamentally altered their willingness to accept segregation and discrimination. They had fought for democracy abroad and were determined to secure it at home. Organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, saw membership surge as veterans joined and took leadership positions, bringing military organizational skills to the freedom struggle. Sergeant Marcus Williams, who had served with distinction in the 92nd Infantry Division, returned to Mississippi determined to register to vote. Despite facing threats and intimidation at the courthouse in his hometown, Williams persisted, citing his military service and constitutional rights. Local black newspapers covered his efforts, and his determination inspired others. Though he faced harassment that forced him to eventually relocate to Chicago, his actions represented the beginning of a broader movement of black veterans refusing to accept disenfranchisement. The memories of Italy remained vivid for many veterans. They had experienced, however briefly, societies where racial prejudice was less pervasive, or at least different from American racism. Some maintained correspondence with Italian friends and families who had welcomed them during the war. These connections provided psychological sustenance during the difficult years of the late 1940s and 1950s, as veterans confronted continued American racism while trying to build lives and careers. In Italy, the impact of the Buffalo Soldiers' presence continued to resonate. Children who had befriended Black American soldiers during the war grew up with memories that inoculated them against racist ideology. When later Italian governments attempted to restrict immigration from Africa, many Italians who had known the Buffalo Soldiers opposed such policies, recognizing the humanity and dignity of people regardless of skin color. The experience had not eliminated Italian racism, but it had created a constituency that questioned and resisted racial prejudice. Several Italian war brides who had married black soldiers and moved to America maintained connections with their Italian families through letters and occasional visits. Their experiences, shared with relatives in Italy, provided Italians with ongoing education about American racial segregation. These women, caught between two cultures and navigating racism in their adopted country, became bridges of understanding. Their letters home described the contradictions of American life, where the Constitution proclaimed equality, while laws enforced segregation. 1948 brought significant changes to the American military when President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating desegregation of the armed forces. This landmark order, influenced by the demonstrated combat effectiveness of black troops during World War II, began the process of military integration. Veterans of the 92nd Infantry Division had contributed to this change through their service and sacrifice, proving beyond doubt that black soldiers could fight effectively and deserved equal treatment. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, saw the first large-scale implementation of military integration as black and white soldiers served together in the same units. Many officers and enlisted men who had served with the Buffalo Soldiers in Italy brought their experiences to this new conflict. They had learned that integration worked, that soldiers judged each other by competence and courage rather than color when survival depended on mutual trust. The lessons learned in Italy's mountains helped shape a more equitable military that would eventually become one of America's most integrated institutions. The 1960s witnessed renewed interest in the Buffalo Soldiers' Italian service as the civil rights movement reached its peak intensity. Veterans who had served with the 92nd Infantry Division participated in marches and demonstrations, their military service lending moral authority to demands for equality. They had fought fascism abroad and now fought racism at home, drawing explicit connections between the two struggles. Their presence in uniform at civil rights events reminded Americans that black citizens had served their country with honor and deserved full citizenship rights. Documentary filmmakers and historians began recording oral histories from these veterans, recognizing that a generation's experiences would soon be lost. These interviews, preserved at institutions like the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, captured vivid memories of combat in Italian mountains, relationships with Italian civilians, and the bitter ironies of facing two different systems of racism. Veterans described firefights and acts of heroism, but also warm welcomes from Italian families and the respect they had received from Italian partisans and civilians. In Italy, a younger generation learned about the Buffalo Soldiers from parents and grandparents who remembered the liberation. Towns that had been liberated by the 92nd Infantry Division erected memorials honoring these soldiers. The town of Sommo Colonia, site of fierce combat in December 1944, created a museum documenting the battle and the black soldiers who had fought there. Local historians collected photographs, letters, and artifacts, preserving the memory of these soldiers who had died liberating a small Italian mountain village. Some Italian war brides, now middle-aged American women, returned to Italy with their children to visit their birthplaces and introduce their mixed-race children to Italian relatives. These visits, sometimes joyful and sometimes complicated, represented the living legacy of wartime relationships. The children, neither fully American nor fully Italian, carried within themselves the history of the Buffalo Soldiers and the social transformation their parents' love had represented. They navigated questions of identity and belonging, their very existence a testament to human connections that transcended racial boundaries. 1973 brought renewed attention when a journalist from the New York Times wrote a series of articles about the Buffalo Soldiers in Italy, interviewing veterans and Italian civilians who remembered them. The articles sparked public interest and led to television documentaries that brought these stories to wider audiences. Americans who had been unaware of the 92nd Infantry Division's service learned about these soldiers who had fought and died for freedom while facing discrimination from their own country. The 1980s and 90s saw academic historians producing detailed studies of the Buffalo Soldiers' Italian campaign, analyzing combat performance, racial dynamics, and social impact. These scholarly works, based on military records, personal papers, and oral histories, provided comprehensive documentation of the division's service. They revealed the complexity of the Buffalo Soldiers' experiences, the excellence of their performance in many engagements, and the systemic racism that had limited their opportunities and recognition. Veterans organizations maintained connections between American and Italian communities. The Buffalo Soldiers Association organized trips to Italy, allowing veterans to revisit battlefields and towns they had liberated decades earlier. Elderly Italian civilians welcomed these aging soldiers with tears and embraces, the bonds formed in war's crucible still strong after 50 years. These reunions provided closure for many veterans, an acknowledgement that their service and sacrifice had mattered and were remembered with gratitude. The 21st century brought new efforts to recognize and honor the Buffalo Soldiers, who had served in Italy during World War II. In 2005, the Italian government awarded special commemorative medals to surviving veterans of the 92nd Infantry Division in recognition of their service in liberating Italy from fascism and Nazi occupation. The ceremony in Rome brought together elderly veterans, some in their 80s, who traveled from America to receive this recognition. Italian officials spoke of how these soldiers had not only liberated territory, but had also helped liberate minds from racist ideology through their courage, competence, and humanity. The descendants of soldiers and Italian war brides formed organizations to preserve family histories and educate younger generations. They collected letters, photographs, and documents, creating archives that documented both military service and personal relationships. These family historians recognized that their stories contained important lessons about racism, war, love, and the power of human connection to transcend artificial barriers constructed by prejudiced societies. In Tuscany, the towns of Massa, Lucca, and Viareggio established historical markers at locations significant to the Buffalo Soldiers' service. These markers, written in both Italian and English, describe battles fought and sacrifices made. They serve as permanent reminders that Black American soldiers helped secure Italian freedom, that they bled on Italian soil defending democracy, and that their service deserves remembrance and honor. Italian schoolchildren studying World War II learn about these soldiers as part of their country's liberation history. The election of Barack Obama as America's first Black president in 2008 carried special significance for surviving Buffalo Soldiers and their families. These veterans had served in a segregated military fighting for a country that denied them basic rights. They had witnessed Italian civilians treat them with more dignity than their own nation sometimes afforded. Now, more than 60 years after the war's end, an African American held the highest office in the land. For elderly veterans, this moment represented the culmination of struggles begun when they refused to accept discrimination after returning from Italy. Modern military historians continue researching and writing about the 92nd Infantry Division, producing increasingly sophisticated analyses of their combat performance, leadership challenges, and the impact of racism on military effectiveness. These studies contribute to broader understanding of how discrimination damages institutions and society. The Buffalo Soldier's story provides concrete historical evidence of how artificial barriers based on race limit human potential and organizational effectiveness. The memory of Italian civilians' responses to Black American soldiers remains instructive for contemporary discussions about racism and prejudice. The rapidity with which many Italians abandoned racist propaganda once confronted with actual Black individuals demonstrates that racial prejudice, while deeply ingrained through systematic indoctrination, can be overcome through genuine human contact and interaction. This historical lesson suggests paths toward reducing contemporary racism through increased interaction, education, and recognition of common humanity. Today, descendants of both soldiers and Italian civilians maintain these historical connections. They organize commemorations, support museums and memorials, and ensure that younger generations learn these stories. In an era when racism persists in various forms worldwide, the story of the Buffalo Soldiers in Italy provides both inspiration and instruction. It demonstrates human capacity for prejudice and discrimination, but also human capacity for change, connection, and recognition of common humanity across artificial racial boundaries. The story of the Black soldiers who arrived in Italy during World War II remains a powerful testament to courage facing multiple enemies, armed opponents on the battlefield, and racism both abroad and at home. Their service liberated not only territory, but also minds, challenging and changing racial attitudes through their demonstrated competence, bravery, and humanity. The Italian civilians who welcomed them questioned their own taught prejudices and formed genuine connections with these soldiers participated in a social transformation with lasting significance. This history deserves remembering not as distant past but as living legacy. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division proved through their service that racial prejudice rests on false foundations, that human worth transcends skin color, and that societies benefit when they reject discrimination and embrace the full potential of all citizens. Their story continues speaking across decades, reminding contemporary audiences that the struggle for equality and dignity remains ongoing, that progress requires courage to challenge injustice, and that human connection provides the most powerful weapon against hatred and prejudice. The Black soldiers who arrived in Italy in 1944 could not have imagined the full impact their service would have, but their legacy endures in the memories they created, the minds they changed, and the example they set for all who followed.